truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. That, of course, is the very famous opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice, the most loved of all of Jane Austen's novels. And it's a sentence that has taken on a whole life of its own. It has been replicated on mugs and carry bags. It has been used by newspaper reporters in a huge variety of different ways. It has become one of the most famous opening sentences in all of literature. But it is followed by a very short chapter 1. And with my good friend Ruth Wilson, we're going to be having a discussion about that opening chapter of Pride and Prejudice. So Ruth, why do you think that wonderful opening sentence gets this novel off to such a great start?
Well, I think it's become famous, number one, because of the sound of it. It is very, very stately. It is beautifully composed, and it reminds me of how very much Jane Austen was influenced in her prose style by the gentleman she calls my dear Dr. Johnson in one of her letters to Cassandra. And in that particular sentence, there is the stately and measured sense of an idea. One of the other things that Jane Austen wrote to Cassandra was that she thought that in this book she was dealing more with notions than with facts, and that was, in that way, she's also following Dr. Johnson. Now, the notion here of a universal truth, or a truth that is universally acknowledged, seems to me to make it is the most important sentence, not only the first, but it is the one that carries the gravitas, whatever gravitas there is in this light and bright and sparkling novel, I think is carried by the testing out of that idea. Is it really a fact? Is it really a truth that a single man with a large fortune is looking for a wife? And we're going to follow the history, the biography of the relationships of Mr. Bingley with Jane and Mr. Darcy with Elizabeth, and in that way we're going to test that proposition.
I agree. I think it's a wonderfully Johnsonian sentence. But Jane Austen, I think, in this very opening line of Pride and Prejudice, is asking her readers to start questioning. And inevitably, we question this first sentence. What is a truth, we have to ask. If you believe in God, well, God is a truth, but if you're an atheist, then there's no truth to God whatsoever. So what is a truth? One person's truth might be another person's fiction. What is universally acknowledged? This is a book set in a little county down in the south of England. There's nothing universal about it. So immediately Jane Austen's asking us to question, what does universally acknowledged actually mean? And then we have a single man in possession of a good fortune. What is a good fortune? We've already seen when we discussed Sense and Sensibility that Marianne's idea of a competence is wealth to her sister Eleanor. So what is a good fortune? And inevitably the word fortune implies some sense of luck. So where is the luck going to come into this novel? Is Mr. Collins just incredibly lucky that Charlotte is there willing to take him? And then lastly it finishes with must be in want of a wife. This implies some sort of lack in the man's life. He's going around feeling that he needs a wife. But Darcy and Bingley don't feel that when we first meet them at the start of the novel. Really the only one who does want a wife is Mr. Collins, and he's willing to take almost anybody who will say yes to him. So immediately, I think, in this opening sentence, we're asked to question, to consider Jane Austen's every word in that sentence, and to really think about how true it is at the start of the novel. Ironically, by the end of the novel, of course, those young men are very much in want of the right wives, so it comes true in the end. But it's such a wonderful opening sentence because it really makes us think.
Yes, and I think your exposition there, Susannah, is so much focused on every irony. within that sentence. Almost every one of those, I mean, it starts with a principal clause, it's followed by a noun clause. Every phrase has a little ironical twist to it. And I think irony is one way of examining that question, and one of the reasons why it has become so celebrated. If ever you want to teach children in a classroom what irony is, read that book, read that first sentence, and keep reminding them of it. But even more than that, I think, or on a slightly different tack, I see it as a sentence again, and this is repeating a little bit but expanding on it, on what I said earlier. Jane Austen lived in a period when there was a lot of talk, especially from philosophers like John Locke, about how you know things, how you know that something is true, how you know it is a fact, as Dr. Johnson would have said, as distinct from some sort of imaginary thing. And in this one, it seems to me that every single example of or every single representation of a relationship is a way, with Bingley and with Jane and with Elizabeth and Darcy, and also the other romantic relationships, are a way of testing out this idea of what is true and what is not true. And already, I think, by chapter 4, you've got that lovely little scene with Jane and Elizabeth, where the words observation and judgment are used. And I think really that is why that sentence, I think, has become so popular with lawyers, barristers and judges. There are quite a few articles that have been written by legal people saying how often they use that sentence. Now, they use it in very funny ways. They use it to say, for example, I read somewhere a judge had said, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a mother who leaves a baby alone in a bath is bound to have trouble, or the baby is bound to be to drown. So it's used in all sorts of ways, yes. But it does show two things. Number one, this novel is very popular with the legal profession, and of course for other reasons, because Austen has so much legal knowledge. But I really think that idea of empirical research and investigation is extraordinarily well demonstrated by the novel Pride and Prejudice, and it's that first sentence that kicks it all off.
And isn't it wonderful the way it immediately moves into giving us a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet? And one certainly gets the sense that Mr. Bennet is not really any longer in want of his particular wife. Quite how he came to marry Miss Gardiner in the first place. He was probably attracted by her prettiness, her flirtations. He didn't really get to know the woman who would become his life partner. And from this first wonderful bit of dialogue between the two of them, we get such a clear sense of their personalities and the sort of marriage that Elizabeth has had in front of her as an example for the whole of her life. So it's a marvellous scene between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet as they discuss the arrival of a young man called Bingley into the neighbourhood. And of course we hear about his income, we hear that he has taken the house of Netherfield, and Mrs. Bennet urges her husband to go and visit him. So very quickly, and this first chapter is 3 pages long, it's a very short first chapter, but we get such a wonderful portrayal of two characters who are never going to cease delighting us when we read Pride and Prejudice. So, Ruth, what are your thoughts on that fabulous bit of dialogue with Mr. and Mrs. Bennet?
I love it, and if I may, I'd like to read just one of the paragraphs where Mrs. Bennet, first of all, I want to say something about Jane Austen's style here. That enormous leap she makes from that very sensible proposition and the way it has been received into the dialogue, I think, is just an example of her comic genius. How she moves from that into, my dear Mr. Bennet, is just extraordinary. And then I did mention the way in which I think that Austen's sentences often reflect the stately, dignified propositions that are recommended by Dr. Johnson. But here we get a different style of sentence altogether. When Mrs. Bennet says, "Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week." Isn't that a jig? Can't you just imagine her doing a little dance of delight? And isn't that part of the stylistic genius in this, as you say, incredibly short sentence? And all of a sudden, you've got everything. You've got the light and bright and sparkling, and you've got everything that she says she didn't give it, which is the irony running underneath. Don't you agree?
Fabulous sentence. And another thing I think that sentence you just read, Ruth, really illustrates is the community of Meryton. And that's very important throughout the novel. And Jane Austen sometimes refers to it as the world. The world it turns against Mr. Wickham when they know he's left gambling debts. And the world feels this about Lydia Bennet coming back upon the community. And here we hear about Mrs. Long, and we hear about Mr. Morris, and we get the sense of gossip, running rife through the Meryton neighbourhood, and Mrs. Bennet is there as part of it all. And she, of course, knows the news. Mr. Bennet retires to his library and tends to stay away from society, so he doesn't always know the news. So it's another wonderful little reminder of the fact that the Bennets are not living there in isolation, that they are very much a part of a community, and the role of visiting newcomers and the desire of a mother of 5 daughters to catch a husband for one of those girls is there very strongly in that opening sentence. We also get little mentions of the daughters. And we hear that Lizzie is not Mrs. Bennet's favourite, that Jane is the handsomest, and that Lydia is the one that has the good humour. But we get a sense that Elizabeth is Mr. Bennet's favourite, because Mrs. Bennet accuses him. "You are always giving her the preference," she says. So although we don't meet Elizabeth in this chapter, we are prepared for her arrival as the one that the intelligent parent likes the most.
Yes, indeed, and the intelligent parent, I think, is starting to sour just a tiny bit in that final paragraph. There is a reference to the meanness, and I can't help thinking that Jane Austen was a little bit mean there about Mrs. Bennet. I know she is irritating, but as it is revealed, and as many of the critics and scholars, and I think you have emphasised this a lot in your writings, Susannah, the need to marry those 5 daughters showed her to be in one way, if not more intelligent, perhaps even more responsible.
The better parent.
Exactly, than Mr. Bennet was. But I do think, again, we keep coming back to the stylistic genius in this first chapter. The way she varies, the way, as you said, that community, you're not told about that community. In that little paragraph, you're actually shown these people. It reminds me of that much later little adage about don't tell, render, don't tell, show. She always shows her characters rather than giving you a little description about them. If there is a description, it comes after you already know them, and it helps to fill them out. Here we really have the prototypes of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and whatever happens later in the book, and I know for many young readers, it certainly was for me as a young girl, it was such a lovely affirmation that other families have parents who bicker as well, and I know it was something about which I felt very, very negative, that my parents bickered, and actually meeting Mr. and Mrs. Bennet at the age of 16 made me feel a lot better about that.
That's interesting, Ruth. My parents very rarely bickered, so I didn't actually relate to the novel on that particular level. But I think as a young reader, I thought Mrs. Bennet was the mother from hell. You know, she was so embarrassing, and I was a teenager, and teenage girls are so sensitive about their parents being a total embarrassment. But as I grew older, I came to see Mrs. Bennet in a very different light. And yes, I think Jane Austen is quite cruel sometimes with Mrs. Bennet, describing her, of course, as a woman of mean understanding. But she is the better parent. You know, Mr. Bennet goes off to that library, he spends plenty on his books, and he does not look after the economic future of his 5 daughters. Mrs. Bennet, in her own vulgar way, is at least trying to do something. And as I became a mother myself, and my children grew up and started to find partners, and then my daughter got engaged, and I did find that I was really resembling Mrs. Bennet myself. It was a little bit of a worry, but I think you do come to understand Mrs. Bennet much better as you get older and move away from that teenage reading where she is the mother from hell. But I really agree with your point, Ruth, about showing and not telling. And Jane Austen does this so brilliantly all the way through Pride and Prejudice. And one little example, and we've not yet met Elizabeth, but we've already heard something about her intelligence. I think that Elizabeth is one of the very few utterly charming heroines in English literature. And it's very easy for an author to say, my heroine is very charming. Jane Austen never tells us that Elizabeth is charming. She just shows Elizabeth's charm in action, charming Mr. Darcy in spite of himself, charming her father, charming her friends, charming her aunt and uncle, the Gardiners. We see that charm in action every time Elizabeth appears. And other authors will tell you again and again their characters are charming, but it's very rare to see an utterly charming heroine in literature. And Robert Louis Stevenson once famously commented that every single time Elizabeth Bennet opened her mouth and spoke, he wanted to fall to his knees and worship her, which I think is such a wonderful reaction, which so many of us have had to Elizabeth.
I think in a way, Susannah, this is why, even for people like me, for whom Pride and Prejudice at this stage of my life is not my favourite of the novels, my favourite is Mansfield Park, Elizabeth Bennet remains my favourite heroine. And the showing, doesn't she do that through the eyes, and the impact of the eyes as the window to the soul, the impact of the eyes on Darcy. And she is flawed. She has to discover how to know herself. Until now, I never knew myself. In my mind, I always see Elizabeth Bennet in a way as the predecessor of Isabel in Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, except that her meditation brings her to so much fuller understanding of what it is to be a woman in the world in which she lives, not the world in which we live now.
Yes.
And I just love the way you read that, Susannah. I think all the time, I think that is the best way to read, comparing somehow the echoes of the book with the echoes in our own memory of our own life. And I think that is another reason that this first chapter just sits in our memories, because there's so much there that reflects what we were living at all the different, I mean, you've probably read it 1,000 times now, and every time it's just a tiny little bit different, because every time you're a tiny bit different person. Isn't that a wonderful thing?
It has been said, of course, that you never reread the same book because you have changed since your last reading, and you bring those changes to a new reading of Pride and Prejudice. Yes, I agree with what you say about Elizabeth's journey and learning, and that wonderful moment that interestingly comes exactly halfway through the book, where Elizabeth is reading Darcy's letter after the proposal, and she says, "Until this moment, I never knew myself." And up until that moment, Elizabeth has been a bit overconfident. Remember, she's her father's favourite. She knows she's the most intelligent amongst the sisters. She's confident, and she's just perhaps a little bit too confident in the opinions that she forms. And after she gets Darcy's letter and realises she didn't know herself as well as she should, she then starts to reevaluate herself. Now, in other novels, such as my favourite, Emma, That moment only comes right at the end of the book. It takes Emma the whole novel to learn really to understand herself properly. But for Elizabeth, it's exactly halfway. And I think something we've neglected to look at are those very important words at the very start of chapter 1, Pride and Prejudice. And people often think, oh, it's Elizabeth who's prejudiced and it's Darcy who's proud. But I think those qualities belong to both of them. That Darcy is a little prejudiced against people further down the social scale, and that Elizabeth is perhaps a little bit too proud of her intelligence, her perspicacity, and that this leads her into some of the mistakes that she makes in the novel. So it's such a great title, isn't it, because it refers to both of them, in the way that Sense and Sensibility, I think, referred to aspects of both of the sisters.
Yes, and I think that pride really comes to fruition in her relationship with Mary. Now, I have a very close relationship with Mary because that's another thing. When I was 15, 16 and first reading it, I was probably a bit more like Mary, I had to say this, than I was like any of the other characters. And I was very sad about the fact that I wasn't as popular and I wasn't as pretty. And I can imagine if I'd had a sister like Elizabeth, I don't know that I would have been admiring her. I probably would have had the green-eyed monster glare sort of staring from both my eyes. But it's very interesting the number of books now that have been written in those mash-ups or smash-ups or whatever they call them, where Mary has been redeemed, and we were both discussing the fact that there are now 2 paragraphs that were left by Hilary Mantel when she died of a book that she was starting to write, which was going to be a mash-up of Pride and Prejudice, and it is going to be about Mary, the marginalised sister, the ugly duckling in that family of rather pretty swans or little ducklings. So there is so much there for every single woman. Let's forget the men for the moment, but I guess I don't know why this book isn't taught in boys' schools and from the perspective of Darcy and Bingley. I think to compare them as suitors would be a really interesting thing for boys to do, and maybe the male would rise to that occasion. But I really think for young women and for girls as we were in different generations, Susannah, they were just wonderful coming-of-age experiences.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. It's a book that should be taught in boys' schools. In my little book, Jane Austen, Antipode and Views, which I did with my friend Anne Harbers, we had a contribution from a teacher who told us that she had used Mr. Darcy's first proposal in a boys' school in Sydney. And the boys all looked a bit bored, and she got them to try and work out what Darcy was doing wrong in that first proposal and how would they approach a girl that they were keen to marry. And she said by the end of it, the discussion was so lively. The boys were all fascinated by what Darcy was doing wrong, why Elizabeth was reacting the way she was. So if you find the right way into the novel for boys, I think it's a very, very valuable read indeed. I first read Pride and Prejudice when my mother read it to me when I was 12, 13. I can't remember the exact age I was. I remember the experience vividly of having her read this wonderful novel aloud to me. And she said, "Darling, I think you might be ready for Pride and Prejudice." We sat down on the bed and she began to read. And I think that for me was a life-changing moment. I had no idea at the time quite what an impact Jane Austen would have on my life, but there is no doubt she has totally changed my life. So that first reading of Pride and Prejudice was really a seminal moment in the whole of my life. Ruth, it's been great fun discussing Pride and Prejudice with you today with this wonderful opening chapter. We share the same love of this novel, and looking more closely just at those short 3 pages, I think has reminded us both of Jane Austen's incredible genius. So I think next time we're going to be discussing that first opening chapter of Mansfield Park. How different from this one we have been talking about today.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to that one because, as I said, it is my favourite for reasons as yet unstated.
Thank you, Ruth. Wonderful to have another conversation about the openings of Jane Austen's novels.